For 634 days, the outside world believed Ernest Shackleton and his 27 men were dead. No signal had come, no ship had returned. The ice had swallowed them completely. What the world didn't know was that somewhere in the darkness of the Antarctic, every single man was still alive, because one person refused to let them die. There is a particular kind of ambition that does not respond to reason. It does not weigh the odds or listen to warning. It moves forward because forward is the only direction it understands. Ernest Shackleton had that kind of ambition, and in the summer of 1914, it was about to drag 27 men to the edge of the known world. By then, Shackleton was already a complicated figure. He had stood within 97 miles of the South Pole in 1909, close enough to feel the air change, close enough to see what he could not reach. He turned back. The decision saved his men's lives, and he knew it. When he returned to England, he was celebrated as a hero, which made the failure sting even more. The pole itself was claimed 2 years later by Roald Amundsen and then by Robert Falcon Scott, who reached it and died on the return journey. The age of polar firsts was closing. Shackleton needed something new. What he devised was the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition. The plan was audacious to the point of delusion: cross the entire continent of Antarctica on foot, from sea to sea, a distance of nearly 1,800 miles. No one had done it. No one had come close. It would require 2 ships, 2 separate crews, perfect timing, and a degree of fortune that the Antarctic had never been known to provide. But Shackleton called it the last great polar journey that can be made, and the world believed him. His ship was the Endurance, a name that would eventually take on a weight no one could have predicted when it was chosen. She was a 3-masted barkentine, built in Norway specifically for polar waters, her hull reinforced with layered oak and steel to resist the pressure of pack ice. She was 144 feet long and could carry enough provisions for 2 years. On paper, she was exactly what the expedition required. Shackleton recruited his crew with methods that were unconventional then and would seem impossible now. He interviewed men for minutes, sometimes seconds. He hired a stowaway he found hiding in a sleeping bag. He chose people based on instinct as much as qualification: a scientist who could also play banjo, a photographer whose work he admired, a surgeon whose calm impressed him. He was not building a workforce. He was selecting 27 specific human beings for an environment where personality could be the difference between survival and collapse. The Endurance departed London in August 1914, the same week Europe lurched into the First World War. Shackleton offered his ship and crew to the British Navy. The Admiralty, somewhat remarkably, told him to proceed with the expedition, and so, while a continent went to war, 27 men sailed south toward a different kind of destruction. They stopped in Buenos Aires. They stopped in South Georgia Island, the last inhabited outpost before the Antarctic, where the whalers who worked those waters gave Shackleton a warning he could not afford to ignore. The ice that year, they told him, was unlike anything they had seen in decades. Pack ice had closed the Weddell Sea earlier than usual and packed more densely. Ships had turned back already. The season was wrong. Shackleton listened. He paused for a month, waiting for conditions to improve. And then, because that kind of ambition does not stay still for long, he ordered the Endurance south. On January 19, 1915, 61 days after entering the Weddell Sea and just 1 day's sailing distance from the Antarctic coast, the Endurance stopped moving. The ice had closed around her in the night, not dramatically, not with a crash or a grinding roar. Quietly, methodically, the way cold works, it had simply closed, and the ship sat held in place as if the sea itself had made a decision. Shackleton climbed the rigging and looked in every direction. There was no open water. There was only ice, stretching to the horizon in every direction, and his ship in the middle of it, like something trapped in amber. He told his men they would wait for the ice to break. Polar expeditions had been held in pack ice before. Spring would come, the ice would loosen, they would sail free. What none of them knew, what Shackleton could possibly not have known, was that the ice surrounding the Endurance had no intention of loosening. It was drifting, slowly and inexorably, in the wrong direction, away from the coast, away from their goal, and it was carrying their ship. They were not trapped, they were passengers now, and the journey ahead was one none of them had signed up for. For 10 months the Endurance drifted. This is the fact that is hardest to hold. 10 months inside a ship that was going nowhere, surrounded by a world that was entirely white, in darkness for half of that time, with no communication with the outside world and no way to know if anyone was even looking. Shackleton made a decision in those early months that said everything about the kind of leader he was. He abolished rank. Not formally, the hierarchy still existed on paper, but in practice, every man aboard did every kind of work. Officers chipped ice alongside sailors, scientists scrubbed decks, the cook had the same standing as the navigator during meals, which Shackleton insisted be taken together by the entire crew. He understood something that most military commanders of his era did not, that morale in extreme conditions is not a luxury, it is the only real resource you have. He staged competitions. He held sing-alongs with the banjo player he had hired. He kept the men busy not because there was work to be done, but because idle minds in total darkness drift toward very dark places. He watched his crew with a quiet intensity that the men felt but could not quite explain. Years later, several would describe the same sensation, the feeling that Shackleton always knew what you were thinking before you said it, that he appeared beside you at exactly the moment you needed him to. But the ice was doing what ice does, and no amount of human ingenuity could change the physics of it. Through the Antarctic winter of 1915, as temperatures dropped to -40 and the darkness became total, the pressure in the ice increased. The floes surrounding the Endurance began to grind against each other. The ship would shudder at night, the timbers groaning in a way that none of the crew wanted to interpret too precisely. And then, in October of 1915, the ice made its move. The pressure came from the northwest, a ridge of ice driving into the hull with a force that no wooden ship, no matter how reinforced, could withstand. The Endurance began to twist. Her timbers buckled inward. Water poured into the hold. The pumps ran continuously but could not keep pace. Shackleton walked through the ship listening to the sounds it made, and what he heard was a ship dying. He gave the order to abandon ship on October 27, 1915. The men pulled 3 lifeboats and as many supplies as they could manage onto the ice. They stood in the polar cold and watched their ship being slowly destroyed around them. Frank Hurley, the expedition photographer, had spent the previous days diving into the flooded hold to recover his photographic plates, glass negatives he preserved in a tin of ice water, keeping them safe while the ship collapsed above him. He emerged with 150 plates. Shackleton made him destroy all but 120 because the weight of the rest was a luxury they could not afford. It took 3 more weeks for the Endurance to fully sink. On November 21, 1915, she slipped beneath the ice, her stern rising at the last moment before she disappeared entirely. One of the crew, looking on, said it felt like watching a living thing die. Shackleton turned away and said nothing. They were now standing on a sheet of sea ice in the middle of the Weddell Sea, 346 miles from the nearest land, with 3 small boats, limited supplies, and no way to call for help. The temperature was well below zero, the ice beneath their feet was drifting, and the nearest inhabited settlement, South Georgia Island, was 800 miles across the most violent ocean on Earth. Shackleton gathered his men and told them something that no reasonable person could have said without lying, and yet he said it without flinching. "Ship and stores have gone, so now we'll go home." He did not say how, he did not say when, he did not say the odds, because the odds did not bear saying. He simply stated the destination as if it were already decided. And something in the certainty of it, the total refusal to entertain any other outcome, held those 27 men together in the cold. What none of them said aloud, but all of them understood, was this: there was no rescue coming. No one knew exactly where they were. The outside world had heard from them in months, and getting home would require a journey so dangerous that even to describe it plainly sounded like madness. The ice beneath their feet was all that stood between them and the sea, and it was melting. They lived on the ice for 5 months. 5 months of drifting on a floe that was slowly shrinking beneath them, rationing food, melting snow for water, sleeping in tents that barely held against the Antarctic wind. Shackleton slept the least of anyone, not because he was punishing himself, but because he needed to know what was happening at every hour, in the tents, in the men, in the ice. He divided himself deliberately across the group. He assigned optimistic men to sleep beside those who were struggling. He moved troublemakers away from each other before conflict could develop. He ate beside different men each day, listening more than talking. He understood that the greatest threat to the expedition was no longer the cold or the hunger. It was the slow psychological corrosion of hope. There was one man in particular who concerned him, a physicist named Leonard Hussey, who had been hired partly because Shackleton liked his face. Hussey was managing, but only barely. Shackleton began giving him small tasks, measuring the ice thickness, recording temperatures, leading minor surveys. Nothing that was strictly necessary, but everything that gave a man the feeling of still mattering, still contributing, still having a purpose. It worked. Hussey held together. So did the others, most of them, because Shackleton would not allow them not to. When the ice finally broke in April of 1916, it broke badly. The floe cracked directly through their camp at 3 in the morning. One man fell through the gap in his sleeping bag. Shackleton reached into the freezing water and pulled him out by hand before the gap widened. He never mentioned it afterward. The man he saved, Ernest, would later describe the moment with the flat simplicity of someone who had processed a near-death experience and found no adequate language for it. "He just pulled me up," he said. They launched the 3 lifeboats into the broken ice. For 7 days they navigated through freezing seas in open boats, surrounded by icebergs, soaked constantly, unable to sleep, eating cold food because no fire was possible in those conditions. The boats leaked. The men's feet froze in seawater that pooled in the bilges. 2 men developed such severe frostbite that amputation seemed likely. Shackleton moved through the boats whenever he could, redistributing weight, checking feet, keeping the weakest men rowing when they needed to keep moving just to stay warm. They reached Elephant Island on April 15, 1916. It was the first time any of them had stood on solid ground in 497 days. One man dropped to his knees and ate handfuls of the bare rock just to feel something that wasn't moving. Another wept without apparent awareness that he was doing so. The island was uninhabited, battered by constant wind, and offered almost no food. It was not a destination, it was a place to stop falling. Shackleton knew within hours that it would not hold them. They had no radio. No one knew where they were. The island was far outside any regular shipping lane. If they waited for rescue, they would wait forever. He made the only decision available to him. Someone had to go for help. That meant sailing one of the lifeboats, a 22-foot wooden vessel called the James Caird, across 800 miles of the Drake Passage and the Southern Ocean to South Georgia Island. This was not simply a dangerous journey. The Drake Passage is the most violent stretch of ocean on the planet. The Southern Ocean has no landmass to interrupt it, meaning waves can build to heights of 100 feet. The average conditions there would sink most purpose-built ships. Shackleton was proposing to cross it in a lifeboat. He took 5 men with him. He left 22 behind on Elephant Island under the command of Frank Wild, with orders, though neither man acknowledged the weight of them, to wait for as long as it took. The James Caird launched on April 24, 1916. What followed were 16 days that pushed the boundaries of what human endurance is supposed to mean. The boat was so small that the crew could not stand upright below deck. Ice formed on the rigging and had to be chipped away continuously, or the weight would capsize them. Sleeping bags became soaked with seawater and could not dry. The men suffered from thirst because their fresh water supply had been contaminated by seawater, and making new water required heating ice that had to be chipped from the rigging while the boat lurched in swells. On the 4th day, the navigator Frank Worsley took the only reliable celestial navigation fix of the entire crossing. 4 minutes of clear sky while balancing on a heaving deck, holding a sextant to his eye. That 4 minutes and the calculation that followed is the reason they survived. Without it, they would have missed South Georgia entirely and sailed into the open ocean until they died. They arrived at South Georgia on May 10, 1916, but they landed on the wrong side of the island. The whaling station they needed was on the north coast. Between them and it was the island's interior, an uncharted range of mountains and glaciers that no one had ever crossed. Shackleton left 2 men with the boat. He took Worsley and the carpenter Tom Crean. They had no map, they had no camping equipment. They had a small stove, 3 days of food, and a 50-foot length of rope. They climbed through the night because the temperature dropped below what was survivable if they stopped moving. When they hit dead ends, they descended and tried again. When the rope ran out on one descent, they sat together on a coil of rope and slid down a mountain face in the dark, not knowing what was at the bottom. At what they calculated to be the final ridge before the whaling station, they heard a sound that Shackleton would later describe as the most beautiful thing he had ever heard in his life. It was a steam whistle, the morning whistle at the Stromness whaling station, announcing the start of the workday. They had been walking for 36 hours. The whistle meant they were close enough. When the 3 men walked into Stromness, the whalers who saw them first stepped backward. They were filthy, frostbitten, their hair matted and wild. The station manager, Thorolf Sorel, had known Shackleton personally before the expedition. He looked at the 3 figures in the doorway and did not recognize them. He asked who they were. "My name is Shackleton," said the man in the middle. Sorel turned away. Later, he told people he had started to cry.
He had believed, like the rest of the world, that Shackleton was dead. But the story was not over. It was nowhere near over. 22 men were still alive on Elephant Island, and the world did not yet know it. And reaching them, as Shackleton was about to discover, would be the hardest thing he had ever done. The rescue of the 22 men on Elephant Island took 4 months and 4 attempts. This is the part of the story that most people do not know. The crossing of the Drake Passage in the James Caird is the part that gets told in films and books, because it has the quality of myth. But what came after is, in its own quieter way, just as remarkable. Shackleton reorganized immediately after arriving at Stromness. He sent Worsley back around the island by boat to collect the 2 men they had left behind. He contacted the British government for a rescue ship, and then, worn as he was, having not slept properly in weeks, having lived in open boats in sub-zero temperatures, having crossed a mountain range on no map and no sleep, he began making plans to go back. The British government was in the middle of a world war and could not easily spare a ship. They offered what help they could, but the bureaucratic pace of it was agony. Shackleton arranged a ship himself, a small steel-hulled vessel called the Southern Sky. They departed on May 23, 1916. They came within 70 miles of Elephant Island before pack ice blocked them completely. They turned back. The second attempt was on a ship borrowed from the Uruguayan government. Same result, pack ice, forced retreat. The third attempt was on a larger vessel, the Emma, arranged with help from the Chilean government. This time they got within 100 miles before the ice stopped them. 3 times Shackleton had sailed towards his men. 3 times the Antarctic had refused to let him through. He returned to Punta Arenas in Chile in a state that people who knew him described carefully as controlled desperation. Here is what was happening on Elephant Island during those 4 months. Frank Wild had kept the men alive by upending the 2 remaining lifeboats and using them as shelters. The space inside was roughly the size of a large wardrobe. 22 men lived inside it for 4 months, sleeping in alternating shifts because there was no room for everyone to lie down at once. They ate penguin and seal. They developed serious skin conditions from the damp. Several suffered from digestive problems. Motivation deteriorated as the weeks stretched into months with no rescue. Wild told them every morning, every single morning, to roll up their sleeping bags and be ready. The boss will come today. He said it when he had no reason to believe it. He said it on days when the weather was so brutal that even the idea of a ship nearby seemed delusional. He kept saying it because the alternative was to stop saying it, and he understood what would happen to those men if they stopped believing. On August 30th, 1916, 105 days after Shackleton had left them, the men on Elephant Island saw a ship. They had seen ships before, in the far distance, on the first 3 attempts, ghost outlines that vanished before they could be certain they were real. This time was different. This ship was closer, and it was heading towards them. It was the Yelcho, a small Chilean steamer that Shackleton had borrowed on the 4th attempt after everything else had failed. The pack ice, by some shift of fortune or season, had thinned enough to allow passage. Shackleton stood at the bow as they approached the island. He counted the figures on the shore.
22. Every single man. The rescue took less than an hour. There was no time to linger. The weather could turn and close the ice around them at any moment. The men came off the island quickly, some of them too weak to climb down from the boats and into the Yelcho without help. When the last man was aboard, Shackleton ordered the ship turned north. He had been gone, in total,
634 days. When the Yelcho pulled into Punta Arenas, the town turned out in the streets. Word had spread quickly. Shackleton had done it. Every man alive. In the chaos of the arrival, with people pressing in from all sides, Shackleton stood on the dock and said almost nothing. He was not a man who processed relief loudly. Later, a reporter asked him how he had done it, how, with no working ship, no radio communication, no support from the outside world, and no precedent for what he was attempting, he had kept 27 men alive for nearly 2 years in the most hostile environment on Earth. Shackleton thought about it. Then he said, "I have never been to a place where there was no hope." The reporters wrote it down, but most of them did not understand it immediately. What he meant was not that the situation had never been hopeless. It had been hopeless many times by any rational calculation. What he meant was that he had never allowed himself to go to that place. He had never crossed that interior border, never looked at the odds and surrendered to them. Not when the ship was trapped, not when it sank, not when they drifted for months on a shrinking ice floe, not when they launched a 22-foot boat into the worst ocean on Earth, not when the first rescue attempt failed, or the second, or the third. The men who came home from the Endurance expedition were not the same men who had left. That is perhaps the truest and most obvious thing about extreme survival. It changes the person who endures it in ways that cannot be fully articulated. Several of the crew returned from Antarctica and went directly to the trenches of the First World War, because after what they had experienced, nothing else seemed quite as frightening. 3 of them died in that war. The rest lived long lives and told the story of the Endurance with the particular combination of matter-of-factness and residual awe that belongs only to people who have seen something no one else has. Frank Hurley's photographs, those glass plate negatives he had rescued from the sinking ship at personal risk, became one of the most remarkable documentary records in the history of exploration. Images of the Endurance trapped in ice, the pressure ridges surrounding her, the moment of her sinking, they are among the most haunting photographs ever taken. They survived because Hurley decided they were worth risking his life for, and because Shackleton let him make that choice. The Endurance herself lay undisturbed on the floor of the Weddell Sea for over a century, until a research expedition located and photographed her wreck in 2022. She was found remarkably intact, sitting upright at a depth of nearly 10,000 feet, her name still legible on the stern. The cold and the dark have preserved her. She looked, one researcher said, like a ship that had simply decided to rest. There is a version of this story that focuses on adventure, the ice and the cold and the crossing and the mountains, and that version is compelling enough on its own. But the deeper story is about something quieter and harder to define. It is about what a human being chooses to carry when everything else is gone. Shackleton's men had no ship, no supplies, no communication, no certainty of rescue. What they had was each other, and they had a leader who had decided, quietly, permanently, without announcing it, that he would not permit a single one of them to disappear. He was not a perfect man. His financial management was chaotic throughout his life. His ambition caused him pain and caused others pain. He was restless in a way that made peace difficult. He would return to Antarctica in 1921 on yet another expedition, and he would die there of a heart attack at 47, years old before the ship had even reached its destination. He was buried on South Georgia Island at the request of his wife because she understood that it was the only place that truly suited him. But none of that diminishes what he did in those 634 days. What he demonstrated was not superhuman ability. It was a particular quality of refusal, the refusal to accept the conclusion that every rational assessment of the situation demanded. He looked at the evidence and rejected it, not because he was deluded, but because he understood something about human endurance that the evidence could not measure. People survive things they are not supposed to survive. Not always, not even most of the time, but sometimes when the person responsible for other lives decides that losing is not an available option, the outcomes shift in ways that cannot be fully explained. Shackleton made that decision somewhere in the Weddell Sea, standing on a sheet of ice watching his ship sink, and he did not unmake it for a single day of the 634 that followed. 27 men went into the ice. 27 came home. That is the whole of it, and it is enough. If this story moved you, if it made you think about endurance, leadership, or what human beings are capable of when they refuse to stop, then consider subscribing and joining us for more true stories of survival, resilience, and the extraordinary limits of the human spirit.